Continuing with my intermittent reflections on playing Star Trek Adventures, saving, of course, my thoughts on the episode for the end of our current episode. So this is one of the intervening bits. Okay, I'm thinking a lot about older science fiction. And part of it is simply due to what I'm pulling off the shelves, of which there are many in this house. And one of the books that I picked up, and this was very much at random, which is part of my point. This book is called Men, Martians, and Machines, and it's named as such and collected as such all the way back in 1958. This is the 1965 medallion edition, presumably paperback. And the stories themselves says in the indicia that these were collected via the author's agent, specifically, not the author. And that would be back in 1958. And reading the stories, and I haven't chased them down or done any research on this, but I'm pretty sure they are from considerably earlier. These are very 40s in many ways. Well, the stories are all about a ship which has been equipped with a brand new, absolutely experimental interstellar drive. And until then, the crew and the skipper and everybody have been running solar system missions. And it's very much, they get information from the experts about how this system might have life, and so they go and they jump out there and then they go and check it out. Remarkable how much of later science fiction pretty much just picks this up and runs with it. And in line with thinking about Star Trek, I want to point out that one of their significant members of the crew is a robot, who is notably, the very first story is about showing us what kind of feelings he has. And from that point forward, he's a very rock solid, very trusted, surprising member of the crew. He's named J. Score. Okay, so here's just a couple of paragraphs. And I'm reading along and enjoying these stories and going, and then I'm read these couple of paragraphs and I kind of stop for a second. Let's see. McNulty is the name of the skipper. So let's see. They're in a dangerous situation, and it goes, "Hope for the best rather than expect the worst," advised McNulty. He gazed round at his crew, then at the sleek shape of the Marathon. "Besides, we're a lot faster than anything limited to a mere solar system, and we know how to take care of ourselves." He patted his needle ray significantly. I'd never seen our amiable skipper look so tough. He had a most disarming habit of understating his sentiments, but at the right time and in the right place, he could be a very hard egg. Nobody, though, could look half as tough as J. Score, who was standing at his side. There was something about that guy's firm, solid, statuesque pose, his brief speeches and rapid decisions, and the fiery eyes glowing in a rock-like face that gave him an appearance of serene power, such as you see on the phlegmatic features of those unknown gods they dig out of strange and lonely places. One is often tempted to find the smoking gun in regard to a beloved franchise or property. And I'm going to suggest that this really isn't possible in the case of Star Trek, that we have, if you will, a bandolier of similarly smoking guns that are strong enough, not to demote into, as they say, just a bunch of bloody daggers, but to think of them as genuinely, high impact influences, or even more than influences, kind of like we're doing that. The obvious ones obviously, include Forbidden Planet, as I've talked about before. But this reading and a variety of others that I've picked up over the years indicate a culture of writing science fiction that really has its roots in the, all the way back in the 20s and was very well established by the 40s, which is, if not lost, it certainly lives on in its impact and the way it frames everything that we call science fiction or various different nodes of canon that we've encountered in some later form. It was very, very well established and was a common language of fandom and a common language of editorship in particular, that is really hard to have contact with. I mean, especially if you're sitting here, even in the context of 1960 Star Trek alone. So what are you working with? You're working with Forbidden Planet, you're working with The Outer Limits, you're working with The Twilight Zone, you're working with Lost in Space, and you're working with this new thing, Star Trek. And you could probably toss in a couple of others in there as well. And even from that perspective, I mean, this is around the time, I'm barely a toddler, at the time that we're talking about. Even then, to look back and say, what is the rich tapestry of science fiction that this is working from? And perhaps the bandolier of smoking guns would be more evident to a science fiction fan of that time. But there is a real filter there, jumping from reading the pulp magazines, because really the venue for science fiction at that time was still the periodical. It looks like a paperback, but you buy it off of a newsstand where you ordinarily buy comics and newspapers and magazines and stuff. And and it comes out in issues. It's a periodical, and it has a specific editorship. It has a specific fan base. It has a specific set of themes. It has a fairly regular stable of cover artists and interior illustrators. And an aficionado of those could almost certainly point to these stories, because it's not a book, right? In fact, it had come out in a book form as a collection around that time. The author I didn't mention is Eric Frank Russell, and he has this immense library of stories out there. These collections, I think, are coming out more or less for the first time around 1960, just before, just after. And it really is. Oh, there's also an array of zines. If you want to go to fantasy, sword and sorcery, you would have Amra and Thud and Blunder. And then there were a whole bunch of them too for science fiction. Well, this is an enormous just tapestry, and it makes me think too. You read in isolation something like The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester, which from where we sit is like, what on earth is this, amazing late 80s, early 90s novel? What is this doing back in 1956? They didn't know anything about this back then. They didn't know what cyberpunk was. They didn't know about, this kind of brutality. They didn't know about the themes. I mean, nobody would get away with a theme like that in 1956. I think we have it all wrong. I think that we encounter such a filtered and such a coalesced and repackaged and franchised version of each. I don't know if there are even cycles or iterations, but of the past, that creates a cycle. When you encounter those repackaged and reinterpreted, represented versions as your new normal, my image of the past becomes kind of homogenized and dumbed down, partly because of what is presented as the past at that time. I specifically refer as a kid. Oh man, if you go back to the early 70s when you say you watch Star Trek and people are like, yeah, I like Star Trek. I saw a couple of issues. Track, they called it. That was the way you mention, they didn't remember the title, unless you were a fan, you called it Star Trek. Well, around that time, if somebody saw that I was reading fantasy and science fiction, here's this little kid who's not 10 years old yet, and he's got his nose in, Time Enough for Love by Robert Heinlein or something. And that's what they would say. They would say, oh yeah, Heinlein, Clarke, Asimov. Anybody who didn't say Star Trek knew that science fiction was composed, of that. And so they would give you books and things. I had an interesting time running things down, and sort of interfacing with a couple of things. One, those few and wonderful adults who actually would say, aha, cool, kid, here, check this out. And, wham, you'd be holding Fritz Leiber's Fafhrd Mouser stories. That's how I got The Hobbit, as a matter of fact. Somebody said, oh, wow, I love that stuff. Okay, look, here's this. I still have that copy, 1974, signed by my friend who gave it to me. And the thing I'm getting at is these people are like, just treasures, and they're not that many. Then you have the people who have had some contact and knew a thing or two and liked science fiction well enough, but didn't really delve into it. And those are the ones who would say, oh yeah, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein. I am now of the opinion, and it is based very largely on the way that I encountered those, that triumvirate was very much a matter of 1960s repackaging of science fiction so that the new stuff or the particular packages could be sold as what they were and billed as contrasted or part of these. It, I think, is combined of two things. One is that these particular authors in some sort of business arrangement were amenable to continuing to write and were amenable to having their stuff put together in some way that was advantageous to a given publisher. So they became the deans of science fiction because of this. And another part of it has to do with content. Because as a kid, I'll be the first to tell you, and especially as somebody who did, I was a devouring reader. So of course I would soak up, they said, Arthur C. Clarke here, and I would start devouring. And what I found was that they weren't hitting. You could see when and how they were. I mean, I think I read Glory Road by Robert Heinlein like 80 times. And a bunch of his other stuff. Of course, the library and my school library are full of his juvenilia, so you read all of those. But, I was a pretty meaty reader. Like I said, I'm picking up, the biggies. I'm reading Stranger in a Strange Land and all this stuff. Don't mistake, too, my personal circumstances, which were culturally colorful. So the context of social unrest, division, changing policies, questioning the society around us. You read The Stainless Steel Rat by Harry Harrison, and you are immediately, if you have any adults around you who are engaged in what you're doing, you are immediately enmeshed in a fairly substantial discussion of whether this is a book that is socially disruptive. I mean, the celebration of, nonconformity, criminality, satire and stuff like that, or whether it is a tonic, a breath of fresh air that we need this stuff. We need to crack things open, and going too far is a good idea because, it's a book. And this debate as part of my readings, being in a generation of teachers who were willing, to go too far, so that I had already read The Star's My Destination many times by the time it was assigned to us in school. But today, can you imagine assigning young students, a text in school with its ending with those events throughout the book, but especially that phenomenal, highly just, I can't even say anarchic or iconoclastic or anything. None of those words suffice for what this book is about. So I'm encountering science fiction and fantasy as anti-establishment and as deeply powerful questioning stuff. And when I eventually got around to being more, mainstream literary and reading, the great authors of the day and the thinking authors of the day, and I'm saying these guys are weak freaking tea in terms of raw social content. I mean, you name any of the bestsellers, the literary deans and deanettes of 1974, and you again, Dangerous Visions, is eating your lunch well ahead of you. So in that context, Heinlein is immediately identifiable, despite all of his efforts to be Mr. Freethinker and Mr., nonconformist. His deep conservatism, his deep Americanism, his deep, almost enraged cry for, can't we just get back to 1914, is so evident and so pointed. And in that, it is highly political material. And that's how I read it. And I read it to know and realize, okay, there's some pretty good stories in there. There's a few in there, especially the juvenile ones, I find to be actually quite excellent novels as such. But I disagree with them. And that's good. That's a good thing to read, a good thing to know. His larger novels are, okay, granted, they're about something, but, they're polemics and they're boring, frankly. The stories ain't great. The point is made in the first 3 paragraphs, and then after that, it's just hammering away. And it's not a very interesting point. Can't we be decent? Can't we be free thinking but not cause any trouble? Can't we be, openly sexy and openly, can't we get over our neuroses a little, kind of thing? And they're like, well, okay, 1950s, sat on a therapist's house a little bit, terrified of the communists. I'm bored. I get it. There's a lot of you guys out there, of a piece with the Travis McGee novels, of a piece with tons and tons of the kind of tough guy, free thinker, non-com hero who somehow manages to, validate basic, middle-class white petit bourgeois, while attempting to be above all that. But, everything about it just validates it over and over. I just cannot see what's going on with Isaac Asimov. Historically, I mean, was he a nice fellow? Yes. Was he a willing contributor to yet more titles to make his publisher happy? Obviously. I'll give a couple of credits to a couple of things. I consider the collection of iRobot stories to be amazing. I don't quite understand how it is that they've been ported into science fiction pop culture the way they have. The 3 laws of robotics are sources of problems and sources of critique of humanity in those stories. After that, I'm not really sure what they are. I find their identity, their use, their plot power in those stories to be absolutely unique and isolated in them. He wrote a set of juvenile novels called featuring a character named Lucky Star, David Starr, his nickname being Lucky. And there's a bunch of adventures, 1950s adventures all around the solar system with his trusty sidekick, who is short and affectionate and jealous and intense. And he's a space ranger. You know, those have some pretty good stories in them. I've revisited the Lucky Star novels, and I was like, this is some rockin' adventure, and it is so boys fiction, however, in terms of its theme. I mean, there is nothing. I mean, you graduate from Boy Scout to Space Ranger, and you do good, damn it, because the Council of Science and everything. It's just our future, writ large. I mean, C.P. Snow standing behind Isaac Asimov, I'm sure, nodding benevolently. It's really very much what it is. Those are the only things by Asimov that I've read that I've liked, and I have read all kinds of other things, and it is just the most gelatinous, oleaginous. It's smooth, and it's a little sticky, and it's oozing, and it's just lubricates you into the future with, all sorts of things. Oh, yes, I also can say that I did enjoy The Caves of Steel, which has a much darker context for everything in it. Although, as I would argue, ultimately ends up, validating being just a decent middle class family. Carrying on, I could keep going. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and just pick on all your favorites and all the gods of science fiction one by one. Arthur C. Clarke just bores the crap out of me. The ideas are completely pedestrian. There's just nothing there. And the stories are no stories. I find no characters. I find no decisions. I find nothing in it. There you go. But hey, his name is somehow associated with 2001. And yes, I've read the short story it's based on. Fine. And again, I mean, it's like an idea, and it's a little idea, and we're going to wrap all these words around it and call it a story. No, not particularly. So what I'm saying is that when you go back a bit and start reading, I mean, I did it with the best of collections at first. Then I realized that best of collections are themselves artifacts. And so then you have to kind of cast your net a little wider, and you have to track things down. And once you start doing that, and the next round of authors that you encounter after that are still familiar to any science fiction fan, people like Henry Kuttner and so forth. But then you start bumping into names that have not survived, where you don't have well-known best ofs, and you don't have, based on the works of in some TV show, and you don't have constant reference to them in the punditry of science fiction. And that's when you bump into things like those two paragraphs. That's when you bump into stuff that, again, must have been the meat and drink of any science fiction reader during the 1950s, so that it just became vocabulary. It became motifs and became what we're talking about during the time that shows like Lost in Space and Star Trek and Doctor Who, which I should have mentioned earlier, got rolling. And that discontinuity of encountering that stuff, particularly in post-publication form. Remember, I encountered Star Trek in its first wave of major fandom after the show was canceled, when the fandom took on We Are the Life of the show. And that first wave, which itself is now lost, completely was silent, filtered away during the mid-'80s. So when you encounter the material that way, and it is your baseline, this is the thing, it really is quite an effort. It really is it's an effort just in terms of time and energy, but it's also cognitive effort. Something weird happens in your brain when you find that your thingness of Star Trek has been exploded. It's no longer a thing when you realize the vast array of material, of things, of stories, authors, thoughts, existing debates or crises of the day in which those things were made, for which something like Star Trek is merely a television coalescence of pieces, and then itself becomes something within which to create. The shift in thinking about that. I mean, that came to me fairly young, but it's kind of nice to know that I can pick something off my shelf at random that I have not read for easily 30 years and really enjoy the stories. And now, from my perspective, just playing Star Trek Adventures, right? And just I run into those two paragraphs, or I run the whole thing, right? Because Jay Score is a main character, and the adventures of where they go and what they encounter and the kind of questions that they encounter. They're not Star Trek episodes, but boy, you can see the Star Trek episodes from here. And it's not just the one book. I'm talking about this whole range of stuff that you read. And it's bits and pieces of each one of them. And then sometimes, especially in this case, you're like, whoa, there's a lot. There's not the smoking gun, but there's a number of things that are more than just diffuse or atmospheric influence. And to be bowled over by it occasionally, in this late stage of library ownership and reading and recognizing that, no, you're not an expert. You're going to be encountering stuff like this that will surprise you or delight you anew, or for the first time now that you've got more perspective. That's a nice feeling. Playing the game and how that relates to that, that's a whole different question. To what extent is playing Star Trek Adventures entering that state of mind, and to what extent is it comfortably checking off a box in franchise fandom? Well worth considering.